If you've got questions about this year's election, or the economy, or both, you're in the right place. I'm Rohit Kumar, and this is Election Watch. Joining me on today's episode is Karl Russo, PwC's National Economics and Statistics Practice Leader and former economist at the Joint Committee on Taxation. Karl, welcome.
Thanks for having me, Rohit.
Before we dive into questions, I'm going to state what I think is relatively obvious, which is that in an election, the state of the economy really matters. And the state of the economy can seem objective. We measure it, there's data, we get it quarterly, but it's also deeply personal to voters in terms of how they experience the economy. So I want to kick off this conversation with a clip from James Carville from the documentary The War Room, which was filmed during the 1992 Clinton campaign. Roll the tape.
Stay focused. Talk about things that matter to people. It's the economy, stupid.
It's the economy, stupid, from the Ragin' Cajun James Carville himself, right? That's a pretty famous quote, and one that's kind of carried us through several elections since then.
Yeah, well, it's really been important to think about how central a role the economy played, not just in that election, but how much it became an issue in all of the ones since then, in terms of figuring out the strategy for the campaigns and how the voters were responding to the economic conditions around them.
Yeah, and look, no matter what side you're on, which party you identify with, the economy does play a big role. Before people head to the polls, they continually factor it in. They ask the voters, like, what do you care about? The economy is always number one, or some version of it. Inflation, my job, wages, things like that. So what I want to ask you, Karl, is could you provide sort of a historical perspective on the economy's role in predicting the outcome of presidential elections?
Certainly. So if you were to know only one statistic about the economy, or really the state of the environment at all, to figure out who was going to win the presidential election, economic growth in the first half of the election year would be a really good indicator. If you knew how fast the economy was growing, you would predict the winner with about 70% accuracy in presidential elections based on that information. And so when you think about the 1992 experience, when it was the economy stupid, as James Carville was saying, economic growth had been slow at the beginning of the year, but was starting to pick up. And for the whole year in 1992, the economy grew at about 3.5%.
We'd be like holding a parade today if we had 3.5%.
We would love to see numbers like that today, right?
Yeah.
For President Biden, if he was, his campaign would be ecstatic. But what was the case in 92 is it was sort of referred to as like the jobless recovery. And so the employment market just wasn't keeping up with that headline growth number.
Yeah, but what about now? So we're not getting 3.5% growth, but where are we on jobs?
Yeah, so the labor market has been relatively robust. We have unemployment rate back down close to the lowest levels that we had seen in maybe 50 years, below 4%. And job growth has been averaging about 240,000 jobs so far this year. So very strong performance.
Interesting. So not as much economic growth, but better job numbers, sort of the inverse of what we had, for example, in 1992.
That's right. The most recent economic growth number that we had was 1.6% growth in the first quarter, which was less than half of where we were back in 1992.
But now, look, in the real world with this election, the state of the economy in Texas or California, New York is not really going to be outcome determinative. There are 7 states that are likely to decide the presidential election, and the map is up on the screen for the viewing audience. We know that unemployment in particular weighs on voter perception in terms of how things are and how people kind of perceive the economy. In these states in particular, could you talk about how unemployment is playing and kind of what the numbers are telling us?
Certainly. So if you look at those states there, you'll see that the one in which Joe Biden is leading in the polls is Wisconsin. And that happens to be the state with the lowest unemployment rate among the battlegrounds. Whereas for many of the others, it's sort of in line with the national level, or in the cases of Michigan and Nevada, it's actually slightly above. And so some of that job market experience might be explaining some of the variation that we're seeing in the popularity of the president.
Okay, so unemployment maybe explains Wisconsin, maybe, but doesn't necessarily do a good job of telling us what's happening in the other states, because you would expect Biden to be doing perhaps better than the polling currently suggests in the states, given the unemployment number. What about economic growth and consumer sentiment? Might that help us explain what's happening in the polls?
So it's still a little bit of a mystery here, as the states that are growing the fastest among those battlegrounds are Nevada and Arizona, the western states with large population increases. They've actually been doing quite well. So when you compare that to places like, Wisconsin's actually sort of at the bottom of the list on the growth side, and the Midwest in general and the industrial states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, have been faring a little bit worse on the growth dimension. So I think if you're looking for something beyond those two figures, you really want to think about the role that maybe inflation is playing as well in the voters' perception of the economy. Some of those states are older states, and so maybe they have more folks on fixed incomes for which the inflation measures are looming larger to their own personal budgets.
Oh, so that's interesting. So maybe this year it's not unemployment necessarily, and maybe not even consumer sentiment or consumer confidence, but the way in which inflation is hitting the individual budget, more fixed, to the greater extent you're on a fixed income, the more inflation really erodes your purchasing power. If you've got wage income and wages are keeping up or trying to keep up with inflation, then maybe you don't like it, but you experience it less acutely than someone whose income stream is not able to keep up with inflation as fulsomely.
Yeah, and I think you're seeing some of that, and you see some of that reflected in sort of consumer sentiment. Like, how do people feel about it? And it's that perception that translates from those raw numbers on, inflation and growth and employment in the particular states into how do I feel about all of those things. And in that case, I think it's only Georgia where you have consumer sentiment is outpacing sort of the average in the United States.
Interesting, but yet in Georgia, former President Trump continues to lead in all of the recent polling that we've seen in that state.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to keep in mind. The economy is an important factor, but it's not the only factor in any election scenario. So all of the other things that might be a player coming to bear as the economy rises and falls, that will help or hurt the incumbent, but it's not the only factor.
Well, and as you said at the top, right, that would give you a 70% kind of a predictive ability, but there is that other 30%, which is still playing a role in this exercise. Okay, we're going to have to bring it to a close now. Karl, thanks for being here and helping us get into the numbers and helping us try to understand what's happening in this election.
Thanks again for having me.
And before we go, it was announced this week that there will be 2 presidential debates, one in June and one in September. We're going to be watching those 2 events very closely and everything in between. Thanks for watching. Stay with us for more policy developments and election updates. Take care.